kind of story for us. It's a biography story. Remember, a biography is a story about somebody's life, somebody who has already lived usually, okay? And it's a story that somebody else writes about somebody's life. But what makes it kind of like this story is, remember, a biography story is facts about that person. It's not made up information. It's real facts and real information about a person who either already lived or is living right now. This story, Talking Tools, is also an informational story. So this story also is going to give you facts and information about something. And remember, in a lot of our informational stories, almost everyone that we have read, we see real photographs because obviously the author wants you to see those real things. Now, remember, the reason why we didn't see real photographs in our Helen Keller story is because there wasn't a lot of photographs taken during that time. Way back in the 1800s, when Helen Keller was a child, a baby growing up, they really didn't use cameras that often. Cameras were a lot different than what they were now, so it wasn't very often that people even had their picture taken. Plus, it cost a lot of money to have your picture taken. So really only people who were rich, had a lot of money, could actually really do it. So, but our stories now, they can have lots of photographs because pretty much everybody, almost everybody, has some kind of camera that they can take photographs and pictures of things, right? Remember, something that we learned with our last informational story on music is we had captions that went along with those photographs. I'm sorry, it was schools around the world, I believe, that had that. The captions are going to tell you a little bit more about that picture. It's different than the headings. The headings tell you what's going to be on the page. Captions tell you what's going to be in that picture. And that was a question that people were struggling with our last question, or last test, was what the captions are telling us. So I want you to keep remembering that in your brain. So, Talking Tools is a story about different machines, different ways that people can talk, even if they aren't able to talk. Remember, Helen Keller could not talk. She could not speak. She could not hear. She couldn't see. She couldn't hear. She was blind and deaf. So she couldn't talk because you have to be able to hear words to be able to learn how to say words. But she did find a way to still communicate. She learned sign language, and she could also talk through or communicate with writing, okay? So let's read through Talking Tools, and then we're going to compare how it's like our story, Helen Keller, and how it's different than our story, Helen Keller. Talking Tools. Helen Keller lived in darkness, but she was curious about the world. Braille helped Keller gain knowledge. Today, people who cannot see still use Braille to help them read. What's Braille again? Does anybody remember what it is? We talked about it in our Helen Keller story. Zayden, what do you remember?
It's like dots that you feel on where you can know it's the word spelled.
Yes, exactly. It's raised dots. So the dots are like little bumps almost that go together, and they go together in different patterns that spell out letters. It doesn't look like a letter A or a B or a C, but the different dots go together to learn letters. And then you can feel it with your finger. You put the letters together to make words, just like we put words on paper. So, but it's for somebody who's blind, can't see. They can touch it with their fingers and feel the words instead of reading the words. Many ATMs, automated teller machines, have Braille labels, for example. That way, blind people can use them to do their banking. And they have a photograph of a gentleman here at the bottom of that page using the Braille on the ATM. He's touching it with his fingers so he can see what it says. Some ATMs even talk. With just one quick motion, users plug headphones into the ATM. Then the ATM tells them what to do. Now, on the top of the next page, it says, a Braille Notetaker is a computer that helps people who cannot see. They type their notes on it using a Braille keyboard. The notes are saved in Braille. Later, they can use their fingers to read the notes in silence on the notepad. The machine can also read the notes out loud. So, at the bottom of page 495, we have a picture of a Braille Notetaker. You might take notes by writing them down on a piece of paper, or writing it down on like a Post-it note or something, or in a notebook. People who are blind cannot do that. because they can't see, first of all, what they're writing on to even know if they're writing on the same thing. They could feel it probably, but they can't see it. But this machine is kind of like a typewriter where they can type their notes instead, okay? And then later, they can either feel the notes that they have written because it prints it out in raised dots paper, or they can press a button on the machine and the machine will actually read back to them what they've written. So if you look, here's our caption for the picture at the top. It says, this girl is using a Braille Notetaker. It uses an imitated human voice to read aloud. And here are some labels that go along with this picture. Where the fingers are is the notepad. So I'm guessing that it would be all the letters from A to Z, one button for each one. And then we have the speaker here in the back of the machine. And then we have dot keys. Okay? So I imagine you probably press these keys in different combinations to make the different letters depending on what you're trying to write. I've not seen one, so I don't know what they really look like in real life. And then on the next page, we have a telephone. What if someone who cannot see has an illness and needs to take a temperature? Use a talking thermometer. There are talking clocks and watches as well. These watches often have Braille faces too. If Helen Keller were alive today, she'd be happy to learn of the many ways technology can help people with vision disabilities. At the bottom of the page, we have some telephones that have large numbers and Braille labels. If you look at the picture in your book or up here on the screen, you can actually see the raised dots on the numbers. So it tells you not only what the number is, but what the letters are, because the letters are helpful on the telephone too. Otherwise, the behavior is just like that of any other phone. So you can use this phone just like a regular phone. It's just the numbers are a lot larger, and it also has Braille dots on it so you can feel them. And a label is pointing to the dots, telling you that it's a Braille label. Plus, on this phone, you have a button to increase the volume. A lot of phones have that. A lot of regular house phones have a button that you can make the volume really loud. Yes, Angelina?
A person who can't hear, how do they use that if they can't hear?
That's a fantastic question. A person who can't hear, there's different levels of whether or not you can hear and not hear. So they may be able to hear really, really loud sounds. So maybe having the volume up, they could still hear what's being said or the phone ringing or something. But also they have telephones too. A person who cannot hear, they actually have a telephone that they can call somebody. They can type in the message what they want to say. And the telephone on the other side, for the person that's listening, it talks to them in like an imitated voice. It also shows it on a screen, so you could read it on the screen. So somebody who is deaf, who can't hear, can call somebody else who is deaf, and they can talk back and forth on the telephone using a screen like a text message. Now we just have phones that text message. Or it calls somebody else with the regular part of the phone. You can listen to what that person is saying to you. Kind of like sending a voice text, okay, where it talks back to you. Yes, Alina?
But what if they didn't have Braille back then and people were still blind?
Well, they've had Braille for a long time. So when Helen Keller was your age, they had Braille. So that Braille's been around for a super long time. They haven't had talking machines for a long time, though. That's only been recently. I think the first talking telephones came out, I was in high school when the first talking telephones came out. So those weren't too long ago. Because a friend of mine growing up, I actually grew up with someone who is deaf. She cannot hear at all. And so she has had one of those telephones. And we would go, every weekend she would give another friend the telephone so we could talk back and forth on the telephone that way. So that was not too long ago that those telephones came out. Then we came up with smartphones, and now people can just text and do things like that. Yes, Alina?
Well, could your friend see?
Yes, my friend is not blind. She's just deaf. She was born deaf. Yes, Angelina?
My mom's friend
And Miss Christine in our cafeteria is deaf.
What?
Miss Christine, who works in our cafeteria, she wipes off the tables and things like that. She is also deaf.
What? Yeah, she has to read our lips.
She has to read our lips, which is really hard when we have masks on, or she uses sign language to communicate.
Or like if we.
So there you go, little fun fact that you just learned.
Oh my God.
Okay. All right, now let's talk about how our story Talking Tools is like our story Helen Keller. How are they the same? Let's do that part first. Who can think of a way that these two stories are the same? How are they alike? Valerie, can you give me a way that they are alike or the same? What kind of stories are they, Valerie? Yeah, in a way they're both informational. This one is actually an informational story. Helen Keller is a biography, but it is also an informational story. It gives information about Helen Keller's life when she lived years ago, okay? So that's one way they are the same. Both stories are giving information or facts about something. Levi, what's another way they're the same?
They are both talking about Helen Keller.
Well, in this story, it didn't mention Helen Keller. But what did it talk about that it also talked about in the Helen Keller story? What was the Helen Keller story talking about?
About Helen Keller.
And how was she important? What made her special enough that people wanted to write a story about her?
Because she was deaf and blind and she learned a lot.
Right. So they're talking about people who are deaf and blind in both of our stories, okay? It didn't specifically mention Helen Keller in our Talking Tool stories, but both stories are talking about people who are deaf and blind. Another way, Gwen, that they are the same.
They both mention Braille. In the Helen Keller story, they mentioned on how Helen Keller learned Braille, and they mentioned Braille a little bit in here.
Fantastic. Yep, they both talk about Braille. Jamie, do you have another way that these stories are the same?
About this?
They talk about people who are deaf. It has an F at the end instead of a TH. Deaf. It's hard to tell when my mask is covering my mouth, but it's deaf with an F instead of deaf with a TH, okay? Those are two totally different things. Deaf with an F means you can't hear. Deaf with a TH means okay? All right. They're two totally different things. All right. So yeah, they're talking about people being blind. They're talking about people who cannot hear, who are deaf. They are talking about using Braille. They're both informational. There's lots of different things that make these two stories the same. Now though, how are these stories different? How is this story, Talking Tools, different, Jose, than our story, Helen Keller? What's one way it's different? What's our Helen Keller story talking about? The whole story is talking about what?
She couldn't see.
Who is she? Our Helen Keller story is talking all about who? Helen Keller, right? That whole story is talking about that person, Helen Keller. This story is talking about what?
No one.
Right, but what is it talking about?
Talking tools.
Yeah, it's machines that are talking, or ways that machines can help people, tools that talk for people. So that's one way they're different, Jose, is Helen Keller is actually talking about a person, Helen Keller. This story, Talking Tools, is talking about different machines or tools that can help people because they talk out loud. What's another way that these stories are different, Angelina?
Talking tools is a short story.
Well, yeah, because usually our supporting stories that go along with our anchor stories are just kind of shorter stories. Yeah, it is. So they are shorter in length. What's something that we see, Kaden, in this story that we might not see so much of in our other story?
It has technology in it, like a phone or like that.
Well, but believe it or not, back then, Braille was technology. Technology, the word technology is just something that can help someone else. So Braille helped someone else. So believe it or not, Braille was a form of technology in its time. But what do we see in this story that we don't see a lot of in the Helen Keller story? We see what in this story that the author likes us to see in informational stories? We don't usually have an illustrator who draws these things because we see what? Photographs! Oh my gosh, thank you. I was afraid I was going to have to keep up with my Vanna White presentation here. Would you like the letter A? Bring! Let me turn it around for you. Okay. Yes, we see photographs in this story because this story was written not too long ago, and the Helen Keller story, obviously, was written a little while ago, but Helen Keller did not have very many photographs during that time. So we see a lot more photographs in this story. Also, too, the photographs have captions, like in the Helen Keller story. It tells you more about what's in that picture, but this story has some labels that go along with the photographs. In the Helen Keller story, the photographs we do have don't have labels with them, okay? So the stories are kind of the same, but they're also a little bit different. All right, go ahead and put that away real quick.